Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, and I would like to welcome you to this special program today, focusing on the elections, the November 3rd presidential elections. I'm honored to welcome you and particularly the audience. And as you know, the elections, the 2020 US elections, have been dubbed by both presidential candidates, as we heard from Mr. Trump actually just yesterday, as the most important election in the history of our country. As a matter of fact, it might be the most important, both in terms of substance and in terms of the participation of the public in these elections. And looking at one of the most recent surveys conducted by Pew Research Center, it shows that 83% of registered voters say that it really matters who wins. Out of that, 85% of Democrats say so, and 86% of Republicans, I believe that way too. This is different from 2016, when only 74% thought the elections then was that important in terms of who wins, and it definitely a lot more than, let's say, the 2000 elections, when only 50 plus percent of the public or the registered voters stated that it was important, the results were important to them. We're about, what now, 42 days, 15 hours, 25 minutes, and 11 seconds away from the election. And it looks like it's anticipated by experts that more than 2016, more than 139 million of us are going to be participating in this election. So it is a massive turnout, should that exceed that. Now, due to the restrictive logistics dictated by the COVID-19 pandemic, this year's conference, which is the 5th annual conference for the Arab Center Washington, has been essentially divided into 3 segments. Today's, of course, day 1. We will look at the domestic context, examining more the voter demographics and political issues that affect the electorate, including some key constituencies of great interest to us at the Arab Center in terms of different communities, particularly focusing on the Arab world and the Middle East. On day 2, which is Friday, September 25th, we will be looking at the more, let's say, global context of the US elections. We'll be looking at US foreign policy in terms of its impact on the elections, particularly with regards to the Arab world. And on the 3rd day, which is Wednesday, September 30th, we will be examining the Arab-Israeli conflict specifically in terms of its role in these elections. If you have not registered yet for day 2 and day 3, please feel free to do so after today's proceedings. Ladies and gentlemen, we're very honored to have convened with us today a very distinguished group of experts on these issues, elections in general, and specifically in terms of the Middle East and its role in US elections and how the elections are being shaped. So thank you, our audience, for joining us. Thank you, speakers, participants, in this conference, for your willingness to participate. And it is my sincere hope that you will find these conversations today and on the 25th and on the 30th of this month throughout the conference to be very insightful, thought-provoking, and valuable. Before I introduce our keynote speaker to kind of set the pace for our discussion today, let me just say this in terms of, first of all, questions. Questions can be submitted. They are welcome. You're welcome to participate. You can submit your questions through the Q&A feature on your Zoom page, or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org, events@arabcenterdc.org. These questions will be conveyed to me, and I will be more than delighted to squeeze as many of them as possible and address them to our speakers. The conference hashtags on Twitter are hashtag Arab Center 2020 and Foreign Policy 2020. Please follow and join the conversation online. With that, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Khalil Kondik, who, as you could imagine, is extremely busy these days, and we really appreciate his willingness to join us today and shed some light on the elections from his perspective based on his rich experience in elections and that of his colleagues at the University of Virginia. Kyle is the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, an authoritative, nonpartisan newsletter on American campaigns and elections, published by the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Prior to this role, Kyle served as Director of Policy and Research for former Ohio Attorney General Richard Cordray, and has experience as a reporter and also as a political columnist. He is the author of Bellwether, a book on Ohio's presidential voting history, which was released in 2016. He is frequently cited expert on American politics and has appeared on various networks, including CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and Comedy Central's The Daily Show. Thank you, Carl, again for joining us today, and the floor is yours. We are anxious to hear what you have to say over the next 20 minutes.
Great. Well, thanks for the kind introduction. Thanks for having me here today. Obviously, what I think is front of mind for everyone right now is the unfortunate passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Friday evening, and thinking about what sort of impact that might have on the election. And obviously, I don't have any really much new data to share on that because it just happened. And so to a certain extent, we're all kind of guessing as to what the effect might be. But you know, I think it's useful to note, as Khalil did, the intense interest in this election so far, in that you see this in a lot of polls that voters are very enthusiastic about voting, very motivated to vote. Republicans are generally more motivated to vote affirmatively for Trump than Democrats are likely to vote affirmatively for Biden, but Democrats are very excited to vote against Donald Trump in this election. And we're all expecting that turnout should be relatively high. And if we were to reach something like 64 to 65% of those eligible, usually a presidential year recently has been more like 60%, something like 64 or 65% would set a modern record, the highest turnout in the 100 years since women got the right to vote. So that's a achievable number, I think, even though the pandemic has disrupted certain patterns. I do think the public really wants to participate, and many states have made it fairly easy to participate in terms of mail-in voting and early voting, et cetera. And the reason I bring all that up, obviously the turnout is very important, but I wonder if, you know, if the effect of the Supreme Court opening is to gin up additional enthusiasm amongst voters, how much more enthusiasm can really be generated if the public's intensity was already white hot. And so that's what I kind of wonder if we will see that much of an effect. I do think it's possible that in some down ballot races, I think that the Brett Kavanaugh hearings maybe contributed to this in 2018, that red states might get more uniformly red, blue states might get more uniformly blue. And potentially that's helpful to Republicans in some Senate races, because a lot of the key Senate races are taking place in states that are more Republican than the nation as a whole. One senator who I do think is hurt by this, and I think who already was trailing, is Susan Collins of Maine, one of the few kind of less conservative members of the Republican Senate caucus. In our Crystal Ball newsletter, which we publish every week, usually multiple times a week this time of year, just this morning we moved Collins from toss-up to leans Democratic. We actually decided to do that prior to Ginsburg's passing, but in thinking about it over the weekend, we thought that this opening isn't all that helpful for her, given that Joe Biden's going to win her state. Collins needs crossover votes, and a Supreme Court opening will remind voters basically about the high kind of partisan stakes in this election. So anyway, the jury's kind of out, obviously, on what might happen with the Supreme Court vacancy. The president, the Republicans seem intent to fill it either before or right after the election, before the new Congress takes office at the start of next year. But one other thing I think to note is that if you're thinking that the opening is going to create major changes in the electorate, we've already had a lot of disruptions this year, and the election has not changed that dramatically much. And so I've got some polling numbers here. First of all, if you look at the two big U.S. polling averages, so Real Clear Politics and 538, which is Nate Silver's site. If you go to March 1st, that was right after Joe Biden won South Carolina, but right before he won Super Tuesday and kind of cemented himself as the the presumptive likely Democratic nominee. March 1st was also before the pandemic really started to play a major role in people's lives. At that time, that was probably about a couple of weeks away. So essentially pre-pandemic, the president's approval rating, it was -6, meaning that his disapproval rating was 6 points higher than his approval rating in the Real Clear Politics average. In 538, it was -9 net negative approval. So poor, but not incredibly poor. Now in Real Clear Politics, Trump's approval rating is -9 net. In 538, it's -9.5. So really very little change. If you look at how Biden and Trump were matched up head-to-head in national polls, remember this is before Biden was actually the nominee compared to now. On March 1st, Biden was up 5 points on Trump in Real Clear Politics. He was up 4 in 538. As of this morning, Biden was up 6 in Real Clear Politics and was up 7 in 538. So again, a few points worse, and those few points could really be the difference between Trump winning and Trump losing. So I'm not saying that the changes aren't important, but what I am saying is that the top line kind of important electoral numbers, president's approval rating, national polls, they really have not changed all that much. The president has maybe lost a couple of points from March 1st. In terms of the differences in the polls between 2016 and 2020, first of all, the parties are more unified, which I think also kind of calls into question some sort of Ginsburg effect, in that you might expect a Supreme Court vacancy to sort of increase partisanship, but partisans are kind of already lined up in their respective corners anyway. Biden generally leads with independents. Trump won independents in 2016, but only by a small amount. There are a lot of voters who call themselves independents, but many of them are kind of hidden partisans, meaning that even if they say they're independent, they reliably vote Democratic or Republican. The true independents, maybe 5–10% of the electorate, they're also the voters who tend to pay the least amount of attention. And so maybe they'd be the least likely to be moved by a Supreme Court vacancy, simply because they're just not all that keyed into the machinations of the court. And then one other difference in the polls is that there are fewer people saying they're going to vote third party this time. And usually what happens in American politics is that third party candidates will poll better than they perform. And I think we saw this with both Gary Johnson, the Libertarian, and Joe Stein, Green Party candidate in 2016. There are Libertarian and Green Party candidates on the ballot in almost every state, but they're probably even less prominent than Johnson and Stein were, who ran in both 2012 and 2016. And there are just fewer voters who say they're going to back third-party candidates, and so the total percentage of American voters in 2016 who voted for someone other than Trump or Clinton was just 6% of the electorate. My best guess is that's going to be a smaller number this time. And so you put all that stuff together, the polls are a little more stable. There are fewer undecideds, fewer people saying they're going to vote third party. I think that's probably better for the person who's got the lead, in this case, Joe Biden. But I also don't think his leads are unassailable. I think that this race, in some ways, reminds me of the 2012 presidential election, in that, and Biden's leads are probably better than Obama's were, generally speaking, but that the numbers were pretty stable. Things didn't jump around all that much. and there weren't that many undecideds. There weren't that many people saying they're going to vote third party. And if that is in fact the case, and you just have the roles reversed here with instead of the incumbent leading narrowly, you've got the challenger leading narrowly in Biden. But Biden can hope that even if there are disruptions along the way, that his lead will endure just the way that Obama's did in 2012. So that would be the hope for him. The reason why Biden is doing better than Hillary Clinton performed on Election Day in 2016 is primarily because of white voters. In that, so non-white voters generally vote pretty overwhelmingly Democratic, and that can be a wide swath of people of different kinds of ethnicities and backgrounds. But generally speaking, you'd expect a Democrat to get roughly 3/4 of the non-white vote, give or take. Biden is not doing really any better with non-white voters than Hillary Clinton did. And in fact, there are some indications he's doing a little bit worse with certain groups in certain places. And one of them that has really come up is Latino voters in Florida, where it seems like Biden is lagging how Clinton did in 2016. But the big difference is white voters. And of course, particularly in the most competitive swing states, those states are all generally, or many of them, particularly the Midwestern ones, are whiter than the national average. And so Biden is winning white voters with a 4-year college degree by more than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. That's a group that used to be very Republican, is now very is becoming more and more Democratic. And Biden is also losing by less among white voters who don't have a 4-year college degree. And that's a group that Trump really dominated with, and that's a group that was already trending Republican, but Trump did really well with. And so one of the things you're seeing, I think, is that some of Biden's best polling numbers are actually coming in some of the kind of purple to blue states, blue swing states that are generally pretty white. So states like Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin and Maine. A lot of people and a lot of advertising dollars, in fact, the lion's share of the advertising dollars have flowed to kind of 6 universally agreed upon key swing states, all of which were won by Trump in 2016. And those are Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania in the industrial north, and then Arizona, North Carolina, and Florida in the Sun Belt. Basically, I think if one candidate wins a majority of those states, they're going to be the next president. If those states split, it's probably going to be really close. Bottom line is, just candidly here, I think that Biden is probably favored in at least 4 of those 6 states right now. The 3 industrial north states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and also Arizona, which is a state that was historically Republican, that I think has pretty clearly been trending Democratic, particularly over the last few years. I do think Trump, I don't know, North Carolina and Florida seem like legitimate toss-ups. There's also another bucket of states, Iowa, Georgia, Texas, and Ohio, all of which the president won by roughly 5 to 10 points last time, but all seem very close in polling. I think the president is still favored in those 4 states, but if he were to lose any one of them, I think that would be a huge red flag for his reelection. And then there are a few states that Clinton won that I think are at least competitive. Nevada, which I think is sometimes written off as a blue state, but actually is I think remains very competitive. Minnesota in the upper Midwest, and then also New Hampshire in the Northeast. I personally think Biden is in good shape in both New Hampshire and Minnesota. He probably is okay in Nevada too, but that's if Trump is going to win a Clinton-won state, I would focus on Nevada. In terms of the vote count, it's going to be a little bit different than we're used to because of so many people voting by mail and voting early. There are a number of states that are at the center of this election that are not really used to having a large amount of mail-in and early votes cast, specifically states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, whereas some other states, specifically like Florida and Arizona, and North Carolina too, those are states where it's historically been, there have been a lot of votes cast before Election Day, and those states are used to counting those votes. And so I would say that if you're looking for a clear indicator of who the winner is, Florida is a good place to look. I think if Florida were to break by just 2 or 3 points, really either way, I think that person probably would be winning the election. Florida also usually counts its votes very quickly. Now, Florida also is often at the center of election controversies, in part because the elections there are often so close. And, given how the year has gone, expecting a clear outcome out of Florida might be kind of foolish. It may be that, let's say, Trump wins Florida by half a percentage point or something. That probably would be indicative of a very close overall national outcome in which the results are not known for a few weeks. But again, if Florida breaks one way or the other, that it's probably breaking in favor of the ultimate winner. So keep that in mind, I think, on election night. That would be my one piece of advice as to what state to watch. Arizona has a very important Senate race. Mark Kelly, the Democrat, versus Martha McSally, the Republican. Arizona is a state where much of the vote will be counted basically immediately. But then there will be a lot of votes that are kind of trickle in over the last in the days following the election. What we saw in 2018 is that those votes skew Democratic. In fact, McSally was leading Kyrsten Sinema, the now Democratic senator from Arizona, on election night. But Sinema ended up winning by about 2.5 points. So if Biden's leading in Arizona on election night, he's probably going to win the state. And even if it's really close and he's leading on election night, Biden's probably going to win the state. And Arizona is another one that's really right at the center of this election. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, the experience we had from the primary was that basically there was a huge partisan split in terms of Democrats being much likelier to vote by mail, Republicans being much likelier to vote in person. The in-person ballots were counted first, and it looked like many more registered Republicans had voted than registered Democrats as we were looking at it on election night. And then as the votes got finalized in the weeks after the election, it actually turned out that significantly more registered Democrats had voted than registered Republicans. So this is a long way of saying that unless something changes, you probably will expect to see Donald Trump leading in Pennsylvania on election night, but you got to keep in mind that that might only be a portion of the votes, and it might be a particularly Republican-leaning portion of the votes, given that Democrats seem much likelier to want to vote by mail, both in that state and other states these days, in part because of the president's criticisms of mail-in voting, and that the Republicans will be likelier to vote in person, and so there will be a split there in terms of voting methods. So that's just something to keep in mind. I hope that the networks and others do a good job of trying to communicate how much vote is in. If you follow elections, you might be used to the percentage of precincts reporting. That is a particularly useless stat these days, because sometimes you'll see a state that's 100% reporting, but then you look back at how many votes they cast in the most recent similar election, and in a presidential election maybe it's 6 million votes, and with 100% reporting it'll be 3 million votes. So you'll know that actually there are way more votes to be counted because of vote by mail. So just keep that in mind. And again, I hope that the networks communicate that better. But whatever your preferences in this election, I would say to just be patient about it. Just briefly on the Senate and House. So our Senate ratings that we just updated this morning, we have 49 seats leaning to the Democrats, 49 leading the Republicans. Obviously, a lot of those seats are not actually being contested because only 35 of the 100 seats are up this year. And then we have two toss-ups, North Carolina and Iowa. We have Alabama as a likely Republican pickup, with Democrat Doug Jones kind of running uphill for re-election. The Supreme Court fight doesn't help Jones at all because it nationalizes his race. On the Republican side, you've got Cory Gardner in Colorado, Martha McSally in Arizona, and now Susan Collins of Maine as at least small underdogs in our eyes. And so we have the Democrats favored in those three states, and then two Republicans held seats in North Carolina and Iowa as toss-ups. And then you've got some other states that are pretty competitive, but where we see an edge for one side. Republicans have narrow advantages in Georgia, in Montana, and in South Carolina. The Democrats have a small edge in Michigan. That's another state that they're trying to defend. Bottom line is, I think I'd probably rather be the Democrats than the Republicans, if only because if you think of Biden as being at least a small favorite for president, which is probably where I am today, you might expect the Senate to kind of go the same way as the presidential race. But there's a world in which Biden wins the presidency but narrowly misses out on the Senate. Democrats are pretty likely to hold the House regardless of what happens anywhere else. And in fact, I think probably the Supreme Court fight in 2018 may have helped the Democrats pick up additional House seats because they were it might have led to more of a backlash vote in some of these highly educated suburban areas where the Democrats have been gaining. And so it might be actually that the court fight is actually helpful to Democrats in the House. But again, they already have the majority, and it's 235 to 200 when the House is at full strength. So again, I don't think there's a ton of action in the House compared to the Senate and the presidential race. So with that, that's what I wanted to talk to you all about. Again, I'd say watch Florida, and as we see the reactions to Ginsburg. Again, I'm not trying to downplay the importance of what happened. Obviously, it's really important. I just can't sit here and tell you that it's going to change the trajectory of the election. Maybe it will, but I'm going to wait for evidence before determining that.
Thank you, Kyle, very much for your excellent presentation. That was very informative and very helpful for our continuing discussions on the election, trying to understand all the complexities involved. I have a series of questions, but for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of gather them in two clusters real quick.
Sure.
One pertains to the Electoral College. Are we going to see, from your perspective, the Electoral College play the same role it did in 2016?
Well, look, I think it's an open question. I mean, again, I think because the president was able to do a little bit better in the crucial swing states than he did nationally last time, you might expect that same trend to continue. And in fact, it seems likely to be the case. I mean, I find it very hard to imagine Trump winning the popular vote, whereas I don't find it that hard to imagine him winning the Electoral College. Maybe that's just because, we're always thinking about the last election when we're handicapping the one to come. But I do think that, Biden's margins in some of the big blue states might be better than they were for Clinton in 2016. Biden's also going to do better almost assuredly in Texas, which is obviously the second largest state. And one that is historically pretty Republican, at least in recent last few decades. So that should sort of pad Biden's popular vote lead, and then it's just a question of how the swing states vote. But yeah, I mean, again, whatever the decisive state in the Electoral College is, if you order them from most Democratic to most Republican, and the one that is, the right at 270, last time that was Wisconsin, and Wisconsin voted about 3 points to the right of the nation. I think we probably should operate under the assumption that that most crucial state is also going to be right of the nation this time as well.
The next series of questions pertain to your reference to a October surprise. You referred to a couple of possibilities there. What, in your judgment, might be really a surprise that might have a serious impact on the elections on a last-minute basis?
Well, look, again, I mean, I think we just had one with the passing of Justice Ginsburg. As for part of what a surprise is that you don't see it coming in advance. Now, I will say that it seems like Senate Republicans are going to release some sort of a report on Hunter Biden's business dealings in Ukraine. That might come out this week. I just read this morning. I don't necessarily know how much that matters, but it is something that's going to get coverage. There is a report going on, the so-called Durham report, about potentially illegal conduct in sort of the Russia collusion investigation. Again, I don't necessarily know how much that matters, but that's something that is probably going to come out. At least some details of it would come up before the election. You never know what sort of disruptions might be going on in other countries that might have some impact on the United States. The trajectory of coronavirus, a coronavirus vaccine, that may matter too. The president will not be shy about touting any sort of shred of progress as some sort of huge breakthrough. Now, again, whether people believe him or not, I don't know, but that's something to consider. But again, I say all these things, and again, there have been so many other developments throughout this presidency and throughout this year in particular, and they haven't changed the fundamental aspects of the race all that much. Again, the president's approval rating doesn't change all that much. Biden's national lead doesn't change all that much. Again, I think Biden is doing better than he was on March 1st, but some of that I think is just consolidation of the Democratic base because he wasn't the nominee on March 1st. So again, it's like a fire hose of news, but it doesn't necessarily seem to move the numbers that significantly.
Thank you, Kyle, very much. We appreciate your time with us today. Appreciate all the information that you gave us today, and we look forward to working with you again in the future.